The neon sign above the entrance hummed with a low, buzzing sound, flickering occasionally as if it were tired of trying to brighten the dark street. Inside the small diner, the air smelled of burnt coffee, frying bacon, and old floor wax. It was late on a Tuesday night, and the usual rush of dinner customers had long since thinned out. The only people left were a few truckers hunched over their plates in the back corner and a group of 3 men in expensive suits sitting in the middle booth. These men in the suits didn't belong in a place like this. They looked like they usually ate in restaurants with white tablecloths and waiters who poured wine from fancy bottles. But they were here, loud and laughing, their voices bouncing off the tiled walls. They had been celebrating a business deal for the last hour, knocking back glasses of soda and coffee, their table covered in plates of half-eaten pie. In the far corner of the room, almost hidden behind a large plastic plant, sat a woman. She looked to be in her late 30s, with tired eyes and hair pulled back into a simple, practical clip. She wasn't a waitress, though she wore a dark apron over her plain clothes. She was the diner's entertainment, though calling her that felt like a stretch to anyone who walked in. Her job was to play the electronic keyboard that had been shoved into the corner space. It was a cheap instrument, made of shiny black plastic that looked like it would crack if you hit it too hard. Several of the white keys were chipped at the corners, and the stand holding it up was a bit wobbly. The woman had been sitting there for an hour, just waiting. The manager hadn't told her to play yet, and the noise from the suited men was so loud that nobody would have heard her anyway. She kept her hands folded in her lap, rubbing her thumb over a rough patch of skin on her index finger. She was used to waiting. She was used to being invisible. Suddenly, the loudest of the 3 men, a big guy with a red face and a silver watch that looked too heavy for his wrists, stood up. He needed to use the restroom, but on his way back, he spotted the woman in the corner. He swayed a little as he changed direction and walked over to her, a sloppy grin on his face. "Hey there," he said, his voice booming in the quiet corner. "What's this, a prop?" The woman looked up, startled. She didn't say anything, just watched him with cautious eyes. The man laughed and tapped the top of the keyboard with a heavy finger. "I didn't know they had live music in this dump. I thought this thing was just for decoration." He looked back at his friends at the table. "Hey, guys. Come look at this. They hired a piano player." The other 2 men chuckled, but they didn't get up. They just watched from the booth, entertained by their friend's behavior. "Come on, then," the big man said, leaning down close to the woman. He smelled like expensive cologne mixed with grease. "Play us a song, give us some background noise while we finish our pie." The woman cleared her throat softly. She sat up a little straighter on the hard stool. "I'm not really on right now," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, raspy, like she hadn't used it much today. "And, to be honest, this keyboard isn't very good. The sound cuts out if you turn it up too loud." The man rolled his eyes. "Excuses, excuses. Look, lady, we're paying customers. We want some music." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change. He sorted through it with clumsy fingers and pulled out a nickel. He tossed it onto the flat surface of the keyboard. The coin hit the plastic and bounced, sliding off the smooth keys and landing with a clatter on the floor. "There," he said, laughing again. "That's your tip. Now play something. Or do you only play if people throw real money?" He leaned in closer, invading her personal space, his face turning mean. "What do you even play for scraps? Do you pick up pennies off the floor to pay your rent?" The woman looked down at the nickel lying on the dusty floor. Then she looked at the man. She didn't look angry. She just looked sad. It was the kind of look that comes from years of being treated like you don't matter. She took a slow breath, calming the nerves that were jumping in her stomach. "I play for scraps," she said. Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been a moment ago. "Because that is all I have ever been given. But even scraps can feed you if you are hungry enough." The man blinked, confused by her answer. He expected her to be embarrassed or to cry. He didn't expect her to speak back with such dignity. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, frowning. "It means," the woman said, "that I play because I have to. Not for money. And certainly not for a nickel." She turned her attention to the keyboard. She didn't look at the man again. She reached out and turned the power button. A small red light blinked on. The machine gave a high-pitched beep that sounded like a toy. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. You're all talk. This ought to be good." He turned back to his table, waving his hand to get his friend's attention. "Listen up, boys. She says she plays for scraps. Let's hear what a scrap concert sounds like." He sat back down in the booth, throwing his arm over the back of the seat, ready to mock whatever sound came out of the cheap speakers. The waitress behind the counter stopped wiping the counter. She looked over at the woman in the corner, worried. The diner felt tense, like the air right before a storm. The woman sat still for a moment. She closed her eyes and let the silence wash over her. She blocked out the fluorescent lights buzzing above her head. She blocked out the smell of the bacon. She blocked out the men laughing at the table. She thought only about the music. She remembered the first time she had touched a piano. It wasn't a shiny new one like in the movies. It was an old, beat-up upright that her neighbor had left out on the curb for the garbage truck. It had been raining that day, and the wood was soaked and warped. But she had sat on the wet sidewalk and pressed the keys. The sound was dull and thuddy, but to her, it was magic. It was the first time she felt like she could speak without words. Now, her fingers hovered over the plastic keys of the diner keyboard. They were cold to the touch, slick and smooth, nothing like the ivory keys she dreamed of. But she knew that the instrument didn't make the music. The heart did. She took another deep breath. She didn't care about the nickel on the floor. She didn't care about the men in the suits. She was going to play. She was going to play like her life depended on it, because for her, in a way, it did. Playing was the only time she felt whole. It was the only time the noise in her head went quiet. The diner fell silent. Even the truckers in the back stopped chewing and looked over. The woman's hands moved. She didn't start with a gentle melody. She struck the keys firmly. The sound that came out was surprisingly full, cutting through the grease and the smoke. The mocking grins on the men's faces faltered for just a second as the first deep chord filled the room. She wasn't fooling around. She was here to work. Her fingers pressed down on the middle keys, and the sound that came out wasn't a gentle trickle. It was solid and heavy, like a rock dropping into a deep pool of water. The vibration hummed through the cheap plastic and into her wrists. For a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The clinking of silverware against plates stopped. The loud man in the suit froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. But the woman didn't look at them. Her eyes were closed, and inside her head, she was miles away from this greasy spoon with its flickering lights. She wasn't sitting on a wobbly stool in a corner anymore. She was 10 years old again, transported back to a small, drafty apartment that smelled of mothballs and old paper. She remembered that tiny apartment vividly. It was on the top floor of a building that leaned a little to the left. The windows were drafty, and in the winter, ice would form on the inside of the glass. But it was home, and it was where her grandmother lived. Her grandmother was a tiny woman, bent over from years of scrubbing other people's floors. Her hands were rough, the skin cracked and red from harsh soaps and hot water, but those hands were the gentlest things the woman had ever known. They didn't have much money. In fact, they rarely had money for anything extra. They bought the bruised fruit from the market because it was cheaper. They wore clothes that were too big because they were hand-me-downs. But her grandmother never complained. She had a saying she used to repeat whenever things got hard. "We take the scraps the world gives us," she would say, smiling tiredly as she mended a torn shirt, "and we make a feast. That is how we survive. That is how we win." The woman's hands moved faster on the keyboard now, playing a series of chords that were sad but strong. The music began to tell a story, not with words, but with feelings. It was the story of how that old piano came into their lives. It hadn't been a delivery. It wasn't a gift from a rich relative. They had been walking home from the grocery store one evening, carrying a bag of dented canned goods, when they saw it. It was sitting on the sidewalk, waiting for the garbage truck. It was an upright piano, covered in dust, with one leg broken off so it leaned dangerously to the side. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys were missing, looking like broken teeth in a smile. To anyone else, it was trash. But to the grandmother, it was a treasure. She saw the potential in it. She saw a voice for a girl who never spoke much. "Look at that," her grandmother had said, pointing with a work-worn finger. "Someone threw away music. We can't let that happen." It took them 2 hours to move it 3 blocks. They pushed and pulled, sweating in the cold air, stopping every few feet to catch their breath. People walked past them, laughing or shaking their heads at the crazy woman and the little girl dragging a piece of garbage down the street. But the grandmother just kept going, a fierce determination in her eyes. They dragged it up 3 flights of stairs, scraping the walls and bruising their knees, until they finally shoved it into the living room. When they sat down to play it, it sounded terrible. The hammers were loose, so the strings just made a dull thumping sound. Some of the notes didn't play at all. But the grandmother didn't care. She spent her evenings tuning it by ear, using a small wrench she had borrowed from a neighbor. She couldn't fix it perfectly, but she fixed it enough. "Music isn't about the shiny wood," her grandmother told her one night, sitting on the bench next to her. "It isn't about having a perfect instrument or a fancy stage. It's about what you feel right here." She tapped the little girl's chest, right over her heart. "If you play with a pure heart, even a broken piano can sing like an angel. We play for scraps, my love, because that is all we have. But we play with everything we have." The woman in the diner hit a high note on the keyboard, holding it down until the sound began to waver. It was a piercing sound that made the hairs on people's arms stand up. She thought about all the nights she spent on that broken bench, playing while her grandmother hummed along from her favorite armchair. They didn't have heat sometimes, so they wore coats inside. They didn't have much food, so they drank hot water to fill their bellies. But they had the music. She played for scraps in those days, too. She played for the scraps of joy she could find in a hard life. She played because it made her grandmother smile, and that smile was worth more than gold. The men at the booth were watching now. The mocking laughter had completely died away. They weren't sure why, but they couldn't look away. The music coming from the corner was too real to ignore. It wasn't background noise anymore. It was a force. The woman didn't know they were watching. She was lost in the memory of her grandmother teaching her a melody. It was a simple folk song, something old and traditional, but the way they played it together turned it into something majestic. Her grandmother had told her that even the smallest things could be great if you respected them. Never let anyone tell you that you aren't good enough, her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed, holding the woman's hand tightly. The world will try to make you small. It will try to give you scraps. But you take those scraps, and you build something beautiful. You show them. The music shifted, getting a little louder, a little faster. It sounded like a heartbeat. The electronic keyboard, usually so tinny and fake, seemed to have a soul under her fingers. She was pressing the keys with a strength that surprised her. She wasn't just playing notes, she was pouring her life into them. Every rejection, every hard job, every night she went to bed hungry, it was all in the song. She remembered the first time she tried to play a real concert hall. She had been so excited. She had practiced for months on a decent piano she had access to at a community center. But when she got there, the judges had looked at her worn clothes and her nervous hands. They didn't even let her finish the first song. They stopped her and told her she didn't have the look of a pianist. They told her to go home. That had broken her. She had stopped playing for 10 years. She had packed her dreams away in a box and taken a job washing dishes, just like her grandmother used to do. She thought her grandmother had been wrong. She thought the scraps were just scraps. But tonight, sitting in this diner, she realized the truth. Her grandmother was right. The scraps were never the problem. The problem was letting people convince you that scraps were worthless. Her hands moved across the keys, dancing over the plastic. She was playing with a skill that shocked the room. The waitress behind the counter stopped drying the glass she was holding. She just stared, her mouth open slightly. Even the big man in the suit had put his coffee cup down. He leaned forward, his eyes wide, listening to the complexity of the chords, the emotion in every phrase. The music was swirling around the room, filling the empty spaces. It smelled like fresh rain and old books, even though the diner smelled like grease. It made people think of their own childhoods, their own grandmothers, their own lost dreams. The woman's fingers started to ache, but she didn't stop. She played for the little girl she used to be, dragging that heavy piano up the stairs. She played for the grandmother with the rough hands and the pure heart. She played for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. She hit a complicated run of notes, descending down the scale like a waterfall. It was flawless. The sticky pedal on the floor squeaked, but she didn't care. She used the noise, keeping time with it, turning a mistake into part of the rhythm. The people in the diner stopped being customers. They stopped being strangers. They became a shared audience, connected by the sound coming from the corner. The air felt different now. It wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It was a place where something true was happening. The woman opened her eyes just a little, looking not at the people, but past them, seeing something they couldn't see. She saw the broken piano in the drafty apartment, and she saw her grandmother nodding at her, proud. The scraps hadn't won. The music had won. And she was just getting started. The sound that filled the room wasn't what anyone expected. When you look at a cheap, plastic keyboard sitting in the corner of a diner, you expect a thin, beeping noise. You expect something that sounds like a toy or a ringtone from an old phone. But what came out of that instrument was deep. It was rich and full, vibrating in the air just like a real, expensive grand piano would. It felt like the sound was coming from the walls themselves, from the floor, and from the chests of the people listening. The woman's hands were moving in a blur. She wasn't looking at her fingers. She didn't need to. Her hands knew exactly where to go. They had done this 1,000 times in her mind, even if she hadn't touched the keys in years. Her fingers danced over the smooth plastic, pressing the white keys and reaching for the black ones with a grace that made it look effortless. But if you looked closely, you could see the muscles in her forearms tighten. She was playing with power. She was attacking the music. The melody she was playing wasn't a simple pop song you would hear on the radio. It wasn't a happy tune that made you want to tap your foot. It was complicated. It had layers. The notes seemed to tumble over one another, like rocks rolling down a hillside, but they never crashed. They landed perfectly. It was a sound that grabbed you by the throat and made you stop whatever you were doing. At the booth in the middle, the three men in suits were completely silent. The loud man with the silver watch was frozen. His hand was still resting on the table near his coffee cup, but he wasn't drinking anymore. His mouth was open just a little bit, his eyes fixed on the woman in the corner. He had been ready to laugh, ready to make a joke about her playing or throw another coin. But the laughter died in his throat before it could even come out. He realized, very quickly, that he had made a mistake. He wasn't listening to a nobody. He was listening to someone who possessed a rare kind of magic. The waitress behind the counter had stopped working completely. She was holding a white coffee pot in one hand, but she had forgotten what she was doing. She was leaning over the counter, her eyes wide, watching the woman's hands. She had worked in this diner for 10 years. She had heard jukeboxes, radios, and drunk people singing along to their phones. She had never heard anything like this. The sound made her feel strange, like a shiver starting at the base of her neck and running down her spine. It made her think of things she hadn't thought about in a long time. Even the truckers in the back, who usually kept to themselves and cared more about their food than anything else, turned their heads. One of them, a big man with a beard, took his hat off and held it in his hands. He didn't know why, but it felt like the right thing to do. The music demanded respect. The song the woman was playing was getting faster. It was building up, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. The low notes were rumbling, shaking the wobbly stand the keyboard sat on. The high notes were piercing and sharp, cutting through the smell of fried food and stale smoke. She wasn't just pressing keys down, she was lifting them up, letting the sound ring out in the silence between the beats. It was fascinating to watch her face. Her eyes were still closed, her head tilted slightly to the side. She looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, but her hands were telling a story of great struggle. You could see the emotions flicker across her expression, now a frown, now a small smile, now a look of intense concentration. She was feeling every single note. It wasn't just a performance to her, it was a conversation. She was talking to the room, telling them things she could never say with words. The keyboard began to protest under the assault of her playing. The built-in speakers started to buzz a little because the volume was turned up so high. But even that buzzing noise seemed to fit the music. It added a roughness, a grit, that made it sound even more real. This wasn't a polished recording from a studio. This was live and raw. It was happening right now, and if you blinked, you might miss it. The man in the expensive suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked down at his shiny shoes, then back at the woman. He felt a strange knot in his stomach. It was guilt. He remembered the nickel he had thrown on the floor. He remembered the cruel things he had said about playing for scraps. He felt small. Sitting there in his custom-made suit, feeling big and important a few minutes ago, he now felt like the smallest person in the room. He realized that while he had money, he didn't have what she had. He didn't have that kind of soul. The music shifted again. It went from the heavy, rumbling low notes to something lighter. It was like a bird taking flight. The woman's right hand moved quickly, playing a series of intricate, delicate notes that floated above the heavy rhythm her left hand was keeping. It sounded like hope. It sounded like the sun coming out after a long, dark winter. It was a sound that made you want to believe in good things again. The air in the diner felt different now. Earlier, it had been tense and full of mockery. Now, the tension was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. The silence from the customers wasn't an empty silence, it was a full silence. It was packed with attention. Everyone in the room was connected by that sound. The usual barriers between people, the rich suits and the working class waitress, the lonely truckers and the quiet musician, had all melted away. There was only the music. The woman's fingers found the highest keys on the keyboard. She played a trill, a rapid alternation between two notes that sounded like a bell ringing in the distance. It was crystal clear. Then, she slammed her hand down on the low keys again, bringing the power back. It was a shock to the system, but a good one. It woke everyone up. It made them feel alive. She played with a kind of aggression that was scary to watch. She wasn't afraid of the instrument. She wasn't afraid of breaking it. She was pouring everything she had left into those keys. Every disappointment, every time she had been looked down on, every time she had to scrape by, it was all flowing out of her fingertips. She was taking the pain of her life and turning it into something beautiful. It was the ultimate act of defiance. The world had given her nothing but scraps, so she took those scraps and made a feast. The sticky pedal under her foot squeaked every time she pressed it down. It was a loud, annoying noise, a mechanical flaw that should have ruined the song. But she didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She kept pressing it, using the squeak as a percussion instrument, a heartbeat that kept time with the music. It showed how good she really was. A true musician can play even when the equipment is broken. They can make art out of a mess. The song was reaching a peak. The rhythm was driving and fast, like a train speeding down the tracks. Her hands were crossing over each other, left hand playing high notes, right hand playing low notes, weaving a complex tapestry of sound. The complexity was staggering. The people watching realized that what she was doing required a brain that worked faster than most people's, and hands that obeyed perfectly. No one moved. No one drank their coffee. No one ate their pie. The diner had turned into a concert hall. The flickering neon light above continued to buzz, but it seemed distant now, unimportant. The only thing that mattered was the woman in the corner. She had been invisible when they walked in. She had been a joke to the men in suits. But now, she was the center of the universe. She was the queen of that small, greasy room, and she was reclaiming her dignity, one chord at a time. The music was proof that she was real, that she mattered, and that she was stronger than all of them. The music continued to rise, filling the diner with a sound that felt like it was lifting the roof off the building. The woman was playing with a level of intensity that was almost scary. Her fingers were moving so fast they were almost a blur, striking the keys with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just hitting notes, she was punching them, pulling emotion out of the cheap plastic that no one thought was possible. She was telling a story now, a story without words that everyone in the room could understand. It was the story of her grandmother, the woman who had taught her that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but about how you held your head up. As her hands danced over the keyboard, the music seemed to mimic the sound of scrubbing brushes against a floor, the hard, repetitive work of a life spent on your knees. The low notes thudded like a mop bucket being set down, heavy and tired. But then, the melody would change. It would lift up, soaring into the high keys, light and full of hope. It sounded like the whistle her grandmother used to make while she worked, a tune that said everything was going to be okay, even when they didn't have enough money for the heating bill. It was the sound of love surviving in a hard place. The people listening could feel it. They could feel the ache of tired muscles and the warmth of a small hug shared in a cold room. The man in the expensive suit sat very still in his booth. He wasn't looking at his friends anymore. He wasn't looking at his watch. His eyes were locked on the woman's hands. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about money or contracts or his own importance. He was thinking about his own mother. He remembered how she used to scrub the floors of his school when he was a boy so he could go there. He remembered how rough her hands were. He had been embarrassed by her then. He had ignored her when she dropped him off at the front gate so his friends wouldn't see her old car. Hearing the music now, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. It felt like a punishment, but it also felt like a release. He realized that he had spent his whole life trying to distance himself from the scraps, trying to prove he was better than that. But this woman, playing her heart out on a broken instrument in a diner, was showing him that those scraps were where the real life was. She was taking the hard things and turning them into gold. He felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, surprising him. He quickly rubbed them away, hoping no one saw. The waitress behind the counter had her hands pressed against her chest, right over her heart. The music was reaching a part of her that she usually kept locked away. She thought about her own dreams, the ones she had put in a drawer when she took this job to pay for her sick father's medicine. She listened to the way the woman played, with such power and such precision, and she realized that giving up on her dreams didn't mean she had to stop hoping. The music was a reminder that as long as you had breath in your lungs, you could still create something beautiful. It made her feel strong, even though she was just standing there in a stained uniform. The song shifted again, becoming more complex. The woman's left hand was keeping a steady, driving rhythm, like a heartbeat that refused to quit. Her right hand was playing runs of notes that cascaded down the scale like water flowing over a cliff. It was a sound of pure liberation. It was the sound of breaking chains. You could hear the struggle in it, but you could also hear the victory. She was playing for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, for every person who had been laughed at or ignored. The electronic keyboard started to struggle a little bit. The speakers were buzzing, overwhelmed by the volume and the force of the playing. Usually, this would be annoying, a sign of cheap equipment failing. But tonight, it just added to the raw power of the moment. It made the music feel alive, like it was fighting against the machine to be heard. The sticky pedal under the woman's foot squeaked loudly every time she pressed it, a harsh sound in the middle of the beautiful melody, but she didn't care. She played right through it. She made the squeak part of the song. It was a sound of survival, a sound of making do with what you have. The diner was completely silent now. It was a heavy, thick silence that hung in the air like the sky before a thunderstorm. No one was eating. No one was drinking. The air seemed to vibrate with the energy coming from the corner of the room. It was as if the music had created a bubble around them, separating them from the rest of the world. Inside that bubble, there was no rich or poor, no success or failure. There was only the sound of the music, which was the sound of a human soul pouring itself out. The woman's face glistened with sweat. A strand of hair had come loose from her clip and was sticking to her forehead, but she didn't move to fix it. She was entirely focused on the keys. Her eyes were closed tight, blocking out the reality of the diner so she could see the reality of her memory. She was playing for her grandmother, imagining the old woman sitting in her favorite chair, nodding her head in time with the beat, her worn hands resting in her lap. She could almost hear her grandmother whispering, "That's it, my love. Play it all out. Don't leave anything inside." She hit a series of chords that were so loud and so deep that they shook the table of the men in suits. The silverware rattled against the plates. The sound was like a wave crashing over a rocky shore. It washed away the cynicism and the arrogance of the room. It forced everyone to be humble in the face of such raw talent and such deep emotion. The music started to climb toward its peak. It became faster, more urgent. The woman's fingers were flying, leaping from one end of the keyboard to the other. It was a display of physical skill that was incredible to watch, but it was the emotional skill that really grabbed you. She wasn't showing off how fast she could play, she was showing how much she felt. Every note carried a weight, a history, a meaning. The people in the room felt like they were on a journey. She was taking them somewhere they had never been before. They were witnessing a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. In a world full of fake smiles and plastic covers, this was painfully real. It hurt a little bit to listen to it, because it was so honest, but it felt good, too. It felt like a healing. The scars of the room, the loneliness, the tiredness, the bitterness were being exposed to the sunlight of her music. She was proving them wrong. Not by shouting back, not by getting angry, but by being undeniable. The quality of her playing was so high that it cancelled out every insult, every nickel thrown on the floor, every mocking laugh. It was a roar of silence that drowned out the noise of their judgment. She was showing them that scraps were just the beginning of something magnificent if you had the courage to work on them. The song reached a moment where everything seemed to hang in the balance. The notes were high and trembling, full of tension. It felt like the top of a roller coaster right before the drop. The entire room was leaning forward, waiting, breathless. The woman took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. She wasn't tired. She was just getting started. She was about to show them the final, most important part of the story, the part where the scraps turn into a feast. The song didn't end with a loud crash or a dramatic explosion of sound that everyone expected. Instead, the woman let the music slow down. She took the rushing river of notes and calmed them, turning them into a gentle, flowing stream. The rhythm that had been driving everyone's heartbeats faster began to soften. Her fingers were no longer hammering the keys, they were caressing them. She played a series of quiet, descending notes that sounded like a heavy sigh of relief. It was the sound of surviving a long battle and finally sitting down to rest. The tension that had been holding the room together began to loosen, but the attention didn't break. If anything, the silence became even heavier now. People leaned in closer, afraid that if they breathed too loud, they would miss the very last sound. She played one final chord. It was a simple, beautiful chord that hung in the air like the moon in a clear night sky. It was a perfect sound, clear and pure. Then, she lifted her hands off the keys and rested them gently on her lap. The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick and vibrating. The sound of the music seemed to stay in the room, swirling around the lights and the tables, refusing to disappear right away. No one moved. The waitress stood frozen with the coffee pot. The truckers stopped chewing. The men in the booth were perfectly still. It was as if the woman had cast a spell over them, and for a few long seconds, they were all living in that single moment of sound. Slowly, the reality of the diner started to creep back in. The refrigerator hummed in the background. A car drove past outside, its tires whooshing on the wet road. But the room had changed. It didn't feel like a greasy, tired place anymore. It felt like a place where something important had just happened. The woman sat on the stool for a moment, her head bowed. Her chest was rising and falling a little faster than usual. She rubbed her thumbs over her fingertips, smoothing out the feeling of the hard plastic keys. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She wanted to hold on to the memory of the music and her grandmother for just a second longer before she had to face the real world again. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and opened her eyes. She looked down at her uniform and smoothed her apron, getting ready to slide off the stool and disappear back into the kitchen. She thought that was it. She thought they would just go back to their coffee and their jokes, and she would just be the anonymous worker in the corner again. But that isn't what happened. At the booth in the middle, the man in the expensive suit stood up. He didn't stand up quickly or awkwardly. He stood up slowly, with purpose. He buttoned his jacket and looked at the woman. There was no smirk on his face now. There was no mockery in his eyes. They were shining, a bit wet, filled with a look of total respect. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, acknowledging what she had done. Then, he extended his hand and brought his fingers together. He began to clap. It wasn't a loud, polite golf clap. It was a single, sharp clap that echoed in the quiet room. Clap. The sound was like a starting gun. The waitress behind the counter blinked, as if waking up from a dream. She put the coffee pot down and started clapping too. Then the trucker in the back stood up and began to clap. Within seconds, the entire room had joined in. It wasn't a polite applause. It grew into a roar of appreciation. People started stomping their feet on the floor. The man in the suit whistled loudly, a piercing sound that showed he was impressed. The big trucker shouted, "Bravo!" Even though he didn't usually use words like that. The noise was chaotic and joyful. It was the sound of people who had been moved, who realized they had witnessed something special. The woman on the stool flinched slightly at the sudden noise. She looked up, surprised. She saw the waitress clapping with tears in her eyes. She saw the truckers smiling and nodding. And she saw the man in the suit walking toward her. She felt a wave of embarrassment flush through her cheeks. She wasn't used to this. She was used to being invisible, to being ignored. This kind of attention felt hot and bright. The man in the suit walked right up to the keyboard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't take out a single coin or a crumpled dollar bill. He unfolded a crisp, new $100 bill. It was green and perfectly smooth. He didn't just toss it on the plastic top of the keyboard like it was a tip jar. He held it out to her with both hands, as if he were handing her a medal or a precious gift. "Please," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "Take this." The woman looked at the money, then up at his face. She saw that his arrogance was gone. He looked like a man who had learned a lesson. "I don't." She started to say, her voice raspy. "I didn't play for this." "I know," the man said softly. "That's why I want you to have it. You play better than anyone I've ever heard in those fancy concert halls I go to. You have a gift. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." He leaned forward and placed the bill gently on the music stand of the keyboard. "And for what it's worth," he added, looking down at the floor where his nickel lay, "I'm sorry. I was a fool. He reached down, picked up the nickel he had thrown, and put it back into his own pocket. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. He was taking back his insult. "Thank you for the music," he said. He turned and walked back to his booth, but he didn't sit down. His friends stood up too. They gathered their things, leaving their half-eaten pie and their coffee. They were quiet now. The man nodded to the woman one last time, and then they walked out of the diner, the bell above the entrance jingling as they left. The woman looked at the $100 bill resting on the stand. To most people, $100 wasn't a fortune. But to her, sitting there in her tired uniform, it felt like $1 million. It was recognition. It was proof that her grandmother was right. The waitress came over, wiping her hands on her apron. She was still sniffing back a few tears. "That was beautiful," the waitress said, her voice shaking a little. "I mean, really beautiful. I had no idea you could play like that. Why do you hide back here?" The woman smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time that night. "I wasn't hiding," she said softly. "I was just waiting for the right time to be heard." "Well, you were heard tonight," the waitress said. She reached out and gently squeezed the woman's shoulder. "You definitely were heard." The woman looked around the diner. The truckers were back to eating, but they kept glancing over at her with smiles. The air felt lighter. The gloom of the place had lifted, replaced by a warm glow. She looked back at the keyboard. It was still just a cheap, plastic instrument with chipped keys. It was still a scrap, but as she rested her fingers on the keys once more, she knew it was a gold mine. She realized that the value of things didn't come from the price tag. It came from what you put into it. She had taken the scraps, the insults, the bad equipment, the lonely nights, and she had made a feast. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just a piano player. She was an artist. And she was proud.